1984 is memorable to me because it's the first year after all of that schooling that I worked for a real grown-up salary and started making real what I called grown-up money. I had passed the bar the year before 1983, but didn't really become employed until March of 1984 when I took my job in the U.S. Attorney's Office, where I stayed until I moved away to Washington, D.C., where then I stayed until I went back to the seminary, which is a story for a whole nother day. It was, by the way, the end of earning a real adult salary for a real adult job. But I did do it for about 11 years. But 1984 was the first year that I did it. So it's kind of a keen moment in my life, and you all know that I'm pretty fond of connecting my travel through time with music, film, books, things of the sort that are happening in the culture, because those are big touchstones for me. What I remember, one of the things I remember about 1984 was a group called Depeche Mode. They had just started their music, and it's the kind of music, they're still together, by the way, that I really like, rather moody and lots of choral structure to it. It's rock, it's pop, it's all kinds of different things. It's intelligent music. When you listen to the lyrics, you have to kind of figure out what the songs mean. Their very first song in 1984 turned out to be their biggest hit, and it was not one of their typical compositions, a moody, overly orchestrated piece, a rather pop piece that you had to dig into the lyrics to really find the sophistication of the music. The song was called People Are People. It was a smash MTV video, if you were around at the time, and that's right when MTV was taking off. And I think that had something to do with the song and the group then becoming intensely popular. The song People Are People deals with the question, if we're all just people, why can't we get along with each other? But it doesn't do a pie-in-the-sky approach. It, in fact, uses a very concrete approach to talk about the difficulties that we have with one another. The lyrics, minus the music, go like this. People are people, so why should it be you and I should get along so awfully? Then the verse goes, so we're different colors and we're different creeds and different needs. It's obvious you hate me, though I've done nothing wrong. I've never even met you, so what could I have done? Chorus, I can't understand. What makes a man hate another man? Help me understand. People are people, so why should it be you and I should get along? Verse. And now you're punching and you're kicking and you're shouting at me. I'm relying on your common decency. So far it hasn't surfaced, but I'm sure it exists. It just takes a while to travel from your head to your fist. I can't understand what makes a man hate another man. Help me understand. Finish. People are people, so why should it be that you and I should get along so awfully? There was a plaque that I had in my college dorm room, that would be the 1970s, and it was Linus from the Snoopy comic strip. It was a single frame, so it wasn't a strip. But I always did like it, stayed in my room for 4 years, got into some Hallmark gift shop, which is where you bought things like that back then. Linus simply says, I love mankind. It's just people that I can't stand. Now it's like the little subtle humor that was in there, because mankind and people actually mean the same thing. Mankind and people are what we call abstractions. Abstractions are movements away from a concrete reality so you can describe something. Example, I would say there were a lot of people in the church tonight, a little bit more than usual. That would be true. That's an abstraction. The proper way to describe the group is to actually write down every one of your names, including the ladies up in the choir and the organist as well, and all the other musicians there, and read all the names out loud and say, that group was in church last night. I may even tell you the number of it when I did it. It would take the length of one of my normal homilies to do that when I simply want to make it the subject of a sentence. So it's so much simpler to say there were a lot of people in church this evening. To say a lot of people suddenly doesn't speak about the composition of the people. Young, old, middle-aged, white, black, other races, Democrat, Republican, Alabama, Auburn, SEC, big, what are they, ACC, Big Ten, Big 8, whatever, all these distinctions and things that we have. I could say that, but I'd simply say there's a lot of people. The concept of abstraction I learned when researching this homily, spending way too much time reading linguistic theory all week. Don't do that, by the way. Just listen to the distillation I do this evening. But it's necessary in language to be able to be abstract, to be able to pull back from the concrete to describe things, or it will simply take us forever to communicate. The problem is the more we move away from the person, the more we lose sense of the person that we're talking about. Which is why Depeche Mode, I thought, was brilliant when they sang "People are people, so why should it be that you and I get along so awfully?" When you realize that we're all people, there becomes this radical equality that comes to us, being all people. And from that sense, Jesus speaks to us in the gospel this evening. As I mentioned in the introduction, in an attempt to trip him up, I always think that's funny when the gospel writer throws that in there, because the gospel writer already knows you don't throw Jesus up. He's the Son of God. But these others, of course, didn't realize that, so they always thought they would catch him in a mistake, that he wasn't as smart as they were. Their problem. Nevertheless, in an attempt to trip him up, they ask him, what is the greatest commandment? Knowing there cannot be any one particular great commandment. Jesus, already sensing what it is they're trying to do to discredit him, instead answers perfectly, theologically, because how else could he answer, right? He's the Son of God. But he says that you must love the Lord with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And you must love your neighbor as yourself. And that these two commandments comprise the entirety of the law and the prophets. If you stop to think about it, Jesus has moved into abstraction. Even God and the word neighbor become, at that sense, abstraction. Think about God for the first hand. Please do. I always think it's important to think about God. Do it often. But you see, the problem with thinking about God is that we have no ability to make it fully concrete. None of us has ever seen him. We can't describe him. Even to say the word him, the pronoun, is to miss the mark, because God's not human or gendered, so it's a different way of speaking about God. We can say that children will tell you he's an old man with white hair, but that again is sort of a childish way to try to concretize a God who's not concretizable. The prophets will tell us that they can't see him, hear him, touch him, access him. In fact, that's the whole thing about talking about God. You have to talk in abstractions because, well, we can't really give any concrete sense of who God really is, what his essence really is. And the same comes true of neighbor. Now, when he says neighbor, the first thing I think of when I was a little child, mother would send me next door to the Sacker's house to ask for a cup of sugar. And I would have no hesitance to do that. Nowadays, you ring the neighbor's doorbell with a cup in your hand, they'd probably shoot you. But back then, they just gave you a cup of sugar to take home. And they might come over and ask for the very same thing. I lived in very different times. What can I say? But neighbor were the people around us. That's what I thought a neighbor was. Jesus is not speaking about the Sackers, although they were really a lovely family. He was really speaking about neighbor being everyone. In fact, this is clear in Luke's gospel. In an attempt to trip him up, one of the Pharisees asks him, "Who is my neighbor?" And Jesus answers with the well-known parable of the Good Samaritan. You know how that turns out. The neighbor turns out to be the avowed enemy of the Israelites, which is a Samaritan. And not only that, a bleeding Samaritan. Therefore, he's a walking, talking disaster in terms of touching something that is unclean. And not only that, he's fallen under the hands of robbers. And not only that, a priest and a Levite passing by. You know how that whole story goes. And Jesus says, who is neighbor? In the end, the listener is forced to admit the man who helps the potentially unclean man is actually the neighbor. So when Jesus is asking, love neighbor, he is not saying something innocuous. He's not speaking about Elizabeth Sacker, who, as I said, was really a lovely woman. He's really speaking in broadly about all them around us. You might say Jesus and Depeche Mode had the same idea. People are people, so why should it be that you and I get along so awfully? You know, we try to contemplate why this happens. Well, this abstraction is part of the problem. And so I think, first of all, when we try to think theologically, a principle I use regularly on our Wednesday night, Adults Growing in Faith Together, a gift that we gather together for faith sharing. One of my common principles is that for those of us that were only educated formally in religion as children, learned only the concrete aspects of catechism. Those are essentially true. They're essentially good teachings. But they're intended to be added on by adult education through the rest of our life, which most people do not do. Learning on an adult level the abstractions of the faith, of which there are many, in order to really begin to embrace and fully understand it. But with that, only the bits of concrete in our mind, we're literally not able to sometimes on a religious basis understand the gravity of the question, who is our neighbor and why must I love my neighbor as myself? Perhaps the question comes from the Depeche Mode song, why is it that we get along so awfully? Or as the song digs a little bit deeper in that first verse, it makes the obvious distinction, different skin colors and different creeds, different people. We know that these are the distinctions that separate us, that make us different from one another. We know that all together too well. How is it that we learn about these differences? How is it that when we're conceived in our mother's womb, we have no sense or knowledge of that whatsoever? The way a child can only pick up concrete bits of information, but not make any abstract meaning from it, that something's different. Turns out the musical South Pacific gives us a clue. South Pacific was written in the early 1950s. Rodgers and Hammerstein. It tells the story of a romance during World War II. And the character I'm going to discuss tonight, Lieutenant Cable, falls in love with a Tonkinese woman who's brown-skinned. And he suddenly realizes he can't take her home to meet his family. Parents say will never accept a brown-skinned woman. The concept of race and prejudice was laying right beneath the veneer of that beautiful musical. And so they wrote a song called Carefully Taught, where Lieutenant Cable explains how his situation has come to be. He's not going to get the girl. He doesn't get her anyway. He dies in a Japanese attack that he's doing anyway. But the song is tragic because it speaks about this phenomenon of drawing differences and how we do it. It goes this way, without the music. You've got to be taught to hate and fear. You've got to be taught from year to year. It's got to be drummed in your dear little ear. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught to be afraid of people whose eyes are oddly made and people whose skin is a different shade. You've got to be carefully taught. You've got to be taught before it's too late, before you are 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate. You've got to be carefully taught. Our sense of this kind of distinction is not innate. We are not born with it. We're taught. Who teaches us principally? The prince of darkness, the father of sin, Satan. Who are his instruments? All of us who take our, we say, allegedly benign prejudices and put them into impressionable minds who are carefully taught to think just like we think, to see things just like we see things, to make distinctions that make that Depeche Mode song so memorable. People are people, so why should it be that you and I get along so awfully? And you know, what really brought this home to me as I've tried to put all of this together is what happened a couple of weeks ago. On October 7th, the Hamas militant organization in Gaza invaded Israel and massacred men, women, and children. It was absolutely horrific. Only in the Holocaust have more Jews died in a single day. 2 weeks before going to the Holy Land. I should be there right now. I'm ashamed to tell you that my initial thought was we are not going to be able to go on the trip, which, by the way, turned out to be true. I'm ashamed it was my initial thought, but it was. It didn't take long for the horror of it to come to me, and it didn't take long of the anger then to immediately come. I remember saying, a validly ordained 24-and-a-half-year practicing Roman Catholic priest, that we need to incinerate the Gaza Strip. Those are the words that left my mouth. The idea that we were going to obliterate the place because of this awful thing that had happened. You know, when I said it, I didn't eat, thank God I said it in an empty house where no one else was around, but I said it without even beginning to think there's 2 million people that live there. Half of them are children. Most of them are women. Many of them are, almost all of them are not Hamas. All of them are just normal people like you and I. People are people. And somehow I was wishing or desiring or in an act of anger, imagining their instant death as some type of price for what had happened in the border incursion. And I'm ashamed of myself as I really thought about it. You know, as the weeks have gone on and the invasion of the Gaza Strip has begun, I suppose it's a military necessary, but I need to tell you, now more people have died in the Gaza Strip than were murdered by the Hamas militants. Am I saying one side's bad, the other side's good? Absolutely not. What I'm saying is real people are dying. Real Israel citizens died. Real Gaza citizens died. Most of them not involved in this conflict one way or the other, living in the wrong place at the wrong time, victims of a stroke of luck and evil that was introduced into a terrorist organization. Before all this is done, more killing's going to happen. I do what most people do. After a while, it's too much, and I quit thinking about it. And I know that's true with all of us. We had another mass shooting this week. So many mass shootings that I thought, oh, there's a mass shooting. I turned around and started reading my email again. It took me a minute to realize, well, there were 16. They thought 22 people. And it caught myself. And I watched longer, but could only watch so much. And you know, in the stories, they start reading their names out loud. Thank God they do that, because it reminded me these were real people that got shot. Real people whose lives were changed forever. And because of abstraction, we call it a mass shooting. Abstraction, we call it a terrorist incident. Abstraction, we call it victims of war. We make that abstraction victims of an earthquake. These things are so big, so overwhelming. We abstract them and we forget those are real people. Well, tonight, Jesus has a wrenching reminder for us that's actually a good thing. We're about to receive Holy Communion, and we're not going to receive a piece of bread. Surely to God, you didn't come here for a piece of bread. The bread becomes the sacred body and precious blood of our Lord Jesus Christ. It's not a symbol. It's not a representation. It's not a depiction. It's not a metaphor. It's none of those things. It is God Himself. God is a person, not a place, not a thing. We are receiving a person, just like those victims of war are persons, they're people. The list of the names of our dead that we placed in the bulletin you heard read out loud this week in our liturgies are real people that lived among us, the people that we knew. We have to always concretize these things to real people. Tonight we receive a real person. When we receive absolution and confession, the real person of God says our sins or are forgiven. You see, God never forgets that we're real people. And now one of the most elemental things taught in our catechism, when as children we had to only learn concrete things, becomes the most important thing of all. God created every person in this world, all 8 billion plus and going of them, and every last one of them made in the image and likeness of God, which is the only thing we have to know. That's what Jesus means by loving God and loving our neighbor. It doesn't mean we can stop war. We can't. It doesn't mean we can defeat terrorism. We probably can't. It doesn't mean that we can eradicate all evils. We can't. It doesn't mean we can stop natural disasters. We most certainly can't. It does mean, however, that we can recognize people as our neighbors. The more we concretize them and make them real people, it becomes impossible to hate them because they're real people, and we make them unhateable. We have done something in our ministry that is truly extraordinary. That group really had it right when they sang in 1984, "People are people." But the better way to finish it would be, "People are people, persons made in the image and likeness of God, just like you and just like me, and that's why we must love them."